Hello and welcome to the summary of faction tutorials for dummies. I assume you've seen the faction tutorials, otherwise watching this video is not going to make sense. If you haven't seen them, go watch them first and then come back to this video. Otherwise we can get started. And we start by talking about stereotypes. Stereotypes are typically incomplete because they rely on a few small pieces of information, and from them you try to derive the big picture. So by nature, they must be incomplete. Sometimes they are distorted, but in any case, at least they are incomplete. Stereotypes are typically also quite strong. So once you form your opinion about a person or a group of people or a certain thing, then it's not going to change so easily. Stereotypes, however, can also be useful in some cases. So if the stereotype is maybe not scientifically derived, but it still functions as a good rule of thumb that tells you what to expect, then this is actually great. So not all stereotypes are bad. If you are a beginner, you probably have stereotypes about factions. And if you are an experienced player, then please recall your days as a beginner. Here are some examples for common stereotypes about Supreme Commander factions. So people see the Restore and think that Aeon is about air, and honestly Aeon also sounds a little bit like air. Just the sound of the word may make you think that Aeon is about air. Perhaps people take into account that the UEF bombers miss their target all the time, and they do see the Percival though, and that's why they conclude UEF cannot be about air, but perhaps it's about ground, with the strong Percival. The Cybran Nation is the only faction with a T3 torpedo ambushing system, so some people derive a specialization into Navy. And Seraphim, well, that's difficult, right? Seraphim, very difficult to categorize, so it may be a cross-category faction if you take this perspective. What if we take another perspective, and we see the Paragon and conclude that Aeon must be a faction about out-ecoing your opponent. And maybe, if you see the UEF Ravager, you think that UEF is a turtle faction, so UEF gives up map control and builds some game enders from a defended position. And Cybran has lots of stealth units, so they need to hide, right? That's their only way of surviving. That's what you could think when you see the Cybran Nation. And Seraphim? Well, Seraphim, again, difficult, right? That's just how Seraphim works. Very strange faction. All units look kind of similar, and it's difficult to form a stereotype about them just because of how strange they are. But perhaps you see the strong shields, and you conclude that this must be something about support units, like the Seraphim artillery and the Seraphim shields. So why not? Perhaps you have some stereotype about Seraphim too. So what do these stereotypes have in common? Well, of course, they are incomplete, and they are probably also strong. So why strong? Well, I see people who are 1500 and higher ranked, and they only play Aeon on the air slot. So Aeon, well, you may think that Aeon is about air, and Aeon certainly has good air units. The Swiftwind is a great asset. But I would say by tendency, Aeon has good defensive air and not so great offensive air, because the offensive Aeon air lacks great snipe options, right? So Strat Bomber doesn't have high area damage, Mercy very unreliable, dies to pretty much anything, and Gunship a relatively low damage per second. So Aeon are maybe not the best offensive air faction, and if you have an offensive playstyle, then you should probably not play Aeon air, but maybe switch to Cybran air or UEF air, right? Or maybe you want to use a Seraphim RD drops, which also works, but certainly not Aeon, right? But people still do it, so you can see stereotypes are very strong. And well, are the stereotypes I listed very useful? Well, certainly not. If a beginner restricts himself to a small portion of the map, expecting that UEF needs to turtle and cannot possibly defend large areas, then the beginner is going to lose against anybody who knows this game a little better. And if a Cybran player is all about intel but doesn't really make use of any rush units or whatsoever, then it's of course going to be difficult for the Cybran player to have any battlefield impact. So you can see most of these stereotypes are not very good. And here's what I did. Well, I just replaced the stereotypes. Since these stereotypes are strong, it is impossible to remove them entirely. People want to have a simplified picture about how factions work, and it's okay to have this, right? As a beginner especially, very difficult to keep the overview, so keep things simple. But what I try to do is provide useful stereotypes. And if you apply the concepts I gave you, like if you consider Aeon a Harp Rush faction, or you consider Seraphim a commander-centric defeat in detail faction, or you consider UEF a swarming faction that relies on pillars and Percival's, and you consider Cybran a Russian snipe faction, then you are going to be in a very much better position than anybody who has these generic stereotypes, who has not reflected about whether these stereotypes are actually useful. So please consider the faction tutorials I provided from this very perspective. They are not supposed to give you insights about the entire faction, but they are going to give you a best practice guideline that is easy to remember, and it actually works because it's practice proven. So thank you very much, good luck, have fun applying what you learned, and see you in one of the next videos.